words and read the pictures, fly with these birds. In it together, set the reaction, ticket to ride, reckless abandon, time on your side, into the future, the water is fine, we're going places. In it together, set the reaction, ticket to ride, reckless abandon, time on your side, into the future, the water is fine, we're going places. You're coming with my intervention, lower the bar, be the exception, pocket the charm, careful distraction, history made.
Northern Ireland, a small step to a giant adventure. Book your next giant adventure at discovernorthernireland.com.
Well, I just want to say good morning to everyone and welcome to our very first face-to-face meeting in a very, very long time. I'm really excited. I'm going to do the boring bit now. We're socially distanced, it's all been approved, and we are below the maximum allowed in the room. You do need to wear a mask if you go outside of this room to the washrooms, which are off to the right, or when we go in for lunch, there's disposable ones there. And aside from that, we don't need to wear a mask in here, and that's that boring bit over. But it is wonderful that everyone is here today. We're really looking forward to this. Just as a point, it's being recorded today, so you will see the camera scan round. So I'm sure no one's annoyed about that, and you can reapply lipstick if you need to. But what I want to say is we have a fantastic panel here today. I am really amazed by who we've managed to join us on a Friday in Belfast. We have Louise Haigh MP. When we did the call for action on this, the first person to support us was Louise. Supported the press release, gave a statement and raised the profile. We're really thrilled she's here. Monica McWilliams, Professor Monica McWilliams.
Legend.
I walked into Women's Aid 30 years ago. I was a small child, and she was there then. She was there then, and she's still here. I think I helped her type some recordings up. She was bringing it out in the open, and she's been the greatest advocate and supporter of Women's Aid. We're thrilled with Alison Morris, journalist. Alison has been so supportive of Women's Aid, and what she's doing is she's bringing that voice out to the public. She's taken those words and the women, and the first article in the Belfast Telegraph, the horrendous one of the deaths since the first lockdown. She is a wonderful advocate for making sure that voice is heard. We're thrilled. And we have Rachel Woods, Malhead, North now. Since the Assembly came back, it's been busy. And Rachel sits on the Justice Committee and is a speed dial to Sonya McMullan and brings the voices of women into that room. They debated to 2 o'clock one morning, and women's voices were coming up on texts that she was reading. It was one of the most emotional things I ever listened to. It was amazing. And that's what Rachel's doing up in our Assembly, working so closely. And we have Ron Lowe, new Chief Executive, the House Executive. Just want to say one thing. When we were doing the work on the committee, we met with the Department for Communities, and I was asked, what's housing got to do with domestic abuse legislation? Now, I don't want to name names, but there could be squatters in this room, ladies, because Camden Street and Pump Street was where we took over properties until we became professional.
Yeah.
But the Housing Executive are the biggest funder of Women's Aid in Northern Ireland. They are wonderful, so we have to acknowledge that. So I'm really pleased you're here today. And our panel chair, Sonya McMullan, champion of all things policy on domestic abuse and so many years experience. And we have a wonderful audience. I'm going to invite you all to think of questions, but we have a brilliant audience here today with knowledge and, more importantly, commitment to work with us on our call for action on a violence against women and girls strategy in Northern Ireland. So without any further comment from me, over to Sonya, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Sarah. As CEO, you've really championed this cause, as have all our Women's Aid members across Northern Ireland over many years. That we have been campaigning and lobbying around this issue. Thank you so much to the panel who have all been such a support in our fight for this strategy to be implemented. But this is the first of many roundtable events that we hope to be hosting. Today is a very select audience because of social distancing and the amount of people that we could have in the room. But we'll be having other roundtables with the women's sector, for example, and other key stakeholders over the coming weeks and months to really raise the profile of this issue and look at how we can fully implement a strategy here in Northern Ireland. This issue has been part of our campaigning and lobbying strategy for many years, and it really goes back. I was talking to Monica this morning and I thought, well, at least whenever Monica did her research in bringing it out in the open in the early 90s, it was gendered and it was allowed to focus on women, but it wasn't, because she's just told me that there was a challenge even then. So it goes back a long time, the relationship in Northern Ireland with policy and legislation development around the gender neutral nature of language and policy and legislation development. So there's no gender definition or reference to the disproportionate nature of the crimes against women and girls. And the focus has been on a gender neutral definition, which really undermines the government's obligations under international law, under the Istanbul Convention and under CEDAW as well. And we have to remember that whenever we're looking at that the approach to domestic abuse in Northern Ireland, it obscures the reality of how abuse is perpetrated, who the victims are, who the perpetrators are. We don't have an appropriate data set here in Northern Ireland to see who needs support, and gender-specific services, what are required to meet the needs of all victims. So on International Women's Day this year, we launched a petition, as Sarah said, to look at how we could implement a violence against women and girls strategy. We had exhausted all options here in the Assembly, and Rachel, I know you'll acknowledge that. You were such a supporter, but we were challenged and we were told, no, you're not going to get a violence against women and girls strategy at this time and within this mandate. So we thought, well, no, that's not good enough. Let's go out, let's challenge this. And with your support, Louise, as well, it really highlighted to other jurisdictions, England, Scotland and Wales, what, you don't have that? Really? You know, you look at England 2010 strategy, Wales 2010, 2014 in Scotland. You know, we're way behind, not only in legislation, but also looking at this particular kind of strategy. So why do we need a strategy? Well, you know, we have a gender neutral strategy through our current strategy, the Stopping Domestic and Sexual Violence and Abuse. But we need a strategy that can be monitored. We need progress reports. And we need something that can really fully implement change and change the lives of women and girls here in Northern Ireland. Domestic and sexual violence, if we look at that context, continues to be underreported. Low prosecution rates as well. So we need improved justice outcomes. We need a joint up response around early intervention and prevention and education and public awareness, and of course around holding perpetrators and offenders to account as well. Many of the key themes that we have in our current strategy, and we acknowledge that, but we really need to look at this in more detail. So there's much more work needs to be done, and this is such an opportunity today to start this conversation with the people around the table. Unfortunately, during the week of our petition, during that week in March, Sarah Everard tragically lost her life. And then we had the murders closer to home of Karen McLean and Stacey Nell, which Alison reported on as well, bringing our figure up to 8 women that had been murdered during that first year of lockdown. That is staggering and not a statistic to be proud of here in Northern Ireland. Per head of population, again, we're going to be some of the highest femicide figures in Europe this year. So this changed so much, and suddenly it started the conversation. And we welcomed that with our own local assembly and people stepping up and wanting to talk about this and wanting to acknowledge that we do need a strategy. So our Justice Minister did present a paper to the Executive Office, and it started the ball rolling on that. But as Sarah said, Louise was very fundamental in your support around that, around your press release and your social media coverage and everything you did in those first weeks. And I remember I was walking from Crawfordsburn to Bangor on a Sunday, and I was listening to, someone had messaged me around Times Radio Peace, and our First Minister was asked around the the issue of the violence against women and girls strategy and said, of course we support that. And I was just screaming down the pathway. And it turned out that Louise is quite good friends with the presenter that day. I maybe tipped her off with a question around that one. So we thank you, sorry for giving away your trade secret. And we thank you so much. And I'd like to hand it over to yourself now for, I know you want to give us some opening comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sonya. I'll stand up for this if that's okay. Well, thank you so much. And it's so nice to be here amongst people that in the last sort of 18 months that I've been serving as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I've come to regard as really good friends. But this is actually the first time I've met in real life many of those people, so it's lovely to be here physically with you all today and to talk about an issue that is really close to my heart and is an issue that I have worked substantively on since being elected as the MP for Sheffield Haigh in 2015, but also has particular connotations here in Northern Ireland, and that I'm really keen to help prioritise and give prominence to across the UK in a Northern Ireland context. My predecessor and the last woman to do this job before me in the Labour Party, McMullan, worked with Monica and many of you in this room to ensure that women's voices were heard during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations and that the issues that mattered to us were given priority. Had women negotiators been absent from the table, issues affecting children and young people, mixed housing, integrated education and community development would not have been given the priority that they so obviously deserve. But sadly, as we all know since then, too often those issues have not been given that priority and they have been neglected. And it's why this debate today and this meeting is so important, because the epidemic of violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland has too long been a silent crisis. Of the many challenges facing Northern Ireland today, I would say it is one of the most serious, the most pernicious, and yet very poorly understood or discussed, particularly in Westminster. And we know the differential impact that conflict has on men and women, how domestic violence often escalates during conflict, but far from dissipate when peace comes, it actually often increases when men put their guns down in the street and turn their violence inwards to the homes. It remains a lasting legacy of the Troubles here. And we see that all too clearly, the violence against women and girls that is now at record levels and effectively normalised in some communities. None of you need telling that we now have some of the highest rates of femicide anywhere in Europe. And for now 2 years running, women are more likely to be a victim of crime than men in Northern Ireland. And as someone who's worked on domestic abuse for many years now, the issues I see in communities here are depressingly familiar to those faced by women right across the UK, but exacerbated almost exponentially by the collective coercive control of paramilitaries across entire communities. And the failure to properly address paramilitarism and the toxic grip it exerts over people has left women isolated and alone, at the mercy of abusive partners and family members unable to return to the police. It needs proper acknowledgement from politicians here and in Westminster, and it is absolutely shocking that Northern Ireland remains the only part of the UK that doesn't have that violence against women and girls strategy. Tackling violence against women and girls is about dismantling the power structures that exist to oppress and suppress women, and so all efforts to tackle paramilitarism must go hand in hand. But obviously, as you all know, an approach focused entirely on criminal justice alone will only act as a sticking plaster on an epidemic that is rooted in the misogyny and inequality that exists across our society. Too often this conversation can be quite nebulous and we struggle to define what we mean more than we ask for a strategy. So I really hope today that we'll start to put the meat on the bones of exactly what we need to see in a specific Northern Ireland context. As a starting point, the Labour Party in Britain has produced a green paper which covers a wide range of the issues, but I think we could work together collectively to really drill down onto exactly what that will mean for Northern Ireland. The UK government has just published its updated version, which does make progress in important areas such as including public sexual harassment for the first time and a major public awareness campaign to drive behavioural change, but it's still not the whole system response that we need to see, and still remains piecemeal, and it fails to recognise, crucially, that domestic abuse is completely interconnected with violence against women and girls, and it retains those two distinct strategies. As the Chief Executive of the Equality and Human Rights Commission has made clear, sustained and sufficient funding for specialist services will be the key to whether that strategy is successful. And as we all know, the solutions span a whole range of policy areas, and that's why it's so important that the Office of the Executive grasps it. It starts from criminal justice across police, probation and prosecution, but it covers everything from housing, health, online regulation to street lighting, sex and relationship education and civil justice. It spans from the very obvious, like better prosecutions for rapes, to the far less so, like for example, Muslim women in my constituency tell me that they're afraid to take public transport for fear of being subject to racial and sexist abuse. And that's why it's so important that lived experiences of women, particularly those of BME backgrounds, LGBT and disabled backgrounds have informed this work and the strategy. If I may, I'll just touch on an issue briefly that too often gets missed in the conversation of violence against women and girls, but it's one I've worked on substantially, and it has produced reform because of the brave experiences and people talking out that are survivors of domestic abuse, and that's the family justice system. As a South Yorkshire MP, I've represented many victims of the Rotherham grooming scandal, victims that were failed by the state at every conceivable and the most extreme levels you can imagine. And one of them came to me a few years ago to tell me that social services in Rotherham had encouraged her son to use the family court to seek access to his father. Her son had been conceived by rape when she was 12 years old, and the father was in the midst of serving a 35-year prison sentence for countless acts of abuse, rape, imprisonment and kidnap. She was faced with the prospect of facing him once again in court, having to justify why her son should not have contact with the man who had perpetuated such serious abuse against her, despite being the star witness in his prosecution and eventual sentencing. This is quite an extreme example of the failures of the family justice system, but to my horror, in subsequent years, working with practitioners and users of the family justice system, it's not as extreme or as uncommon as it should be. Perpetrators are too often allowed to use the family justice system to perpetuate their abuse over their victims and to use the children as a means of control. The fact that the proceedings are private, understandably, to protect anonymity, means that there is little to no accountability. And when judges' rulings have been exposed, for example, Court of Appeal rulings, they have been found to demonstrate the most archaic and misogynistic views that would not be acceptable in any other branch of the judiciary. Children are too often seen as bystanders to the abuse and not victims in and of themselves, and the presumption that both parents should have contact regardless of abuse means that children are too often put at risk of forced contact with abusive fathers. To protect women and children who have suffered abuse in the family court system, they must be joined up with the criminal courts so everyone understands the abuse that is suffered. The presumption of shared contact in cases of domestic abuse must be removed, and they need to be opened up to reporting so that we understand intrusive decisions by the state that are made there. And finally, as you've said, the government must be held to account on this strategy. It must be monitored on a regular basis. It is in part because there is no formal mechanism by which the UK government is held to account, that its responses have been piecemeal, inadequate, and lacking the urgency the problem requires. We could look to the Welsh Government's example in their 2015 Act, which set out 10 national indicators of progress by which the government can be measured and held to account. Now, all of this is just a tiny part of the work that is needed to tackle the endemic misogyny in our society that leads to violence of all kinds against women and girls. The experiences of many of you in this room and of women and girls across Northern Ireland demonstrate that this cannot be separate from, but is absolutely integral to peace building. And so I want to thank you again for allowing me to be part of this conversation and for coming together. All of us have both the responsibility and the power to affect real change here, and I'm really excited to be part of the debate and discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. And a useful reading is the Green Paper by the Labour Party on Violence Against Women and Girls, and also the new strategy that was launched in July by the Home Office as well, because there is no point in reinventing the wheel, although we have a very unique situation here in Northern Ireland. And as you have highlighted, which none of our strategies to date have addressed, really. you know, the unique situation that we do have here in Northern Ireland. So I think that brings me over to our Professor Monica McWilliams with regard to the Northern Ireland context, Monica, and someone who has produced research for over 30 years on this issue, and really through starting with bringing it out in the open, you know. And of course, one of the recommendations within that was for a 24-hour helpline. Look what happened there. And so, you know, it developed into a wonderful service. So it's over to you really for that Northern Ireland context and your learning over the last number of years and how you think we need to move forward with this strategy, Monica. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Sonya. I'm delighted to be back amongst old friends of St. Alison's, like my first outing. And what an outing. So this is the place that I would call home, and I loved when I got this email that describes me as a renowned academic. But you get kind of emails like that, especially when you're retired. You kind of sit in the house and then you realise this is the kind of work that brought me to this place. And you said 30 years ago. I hate to tell you, it was 50 years ago. And you were definitely a baby, Sarah, when that happened, and you brought back memories of those brave women. Louise, we had a great friend in Derry called Kathy Harkin that Mary will remember, and Avla. And they used to have to go round the pubs to collect money for the refuge. And it was Kathy who coined the great phrase, "We live in an armed patriarchy." And as a result of that great phrase on the last nights of the peace negotiations and Good Friday, it was Good Friday morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning. You can imagine how difficult it was in the human rights section for us to sit down and convince the civil servants, the officials of both British and Irish. But we had this lovely man who had been in the Labour Party called Tony Beaton, because I've just recently written a book and I wanted to find his name and acknowledge him. And he had an awful proper accent. And he came in at 3 o'clock in the morning and we said, we need the right of women to full political participation in Northern Ireland. He said, why amongst these rights? And we said, we lived in an armed patriarchy. And he stopped for a minute and he said, yes, I think I can get that. I can go into the chapeau. We had to go and look up what a chapeau was. It actually meant the preamble. And it made its way in at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was our thinking about domestic violence and what stops women from going into public life. It stopped, the misogyny, the attitudes, stay in the home, all the things that were said to us. And the book is full of that. I've had to get a lawyer to look over it to take some of that out. Because unless it was on the record, as you know.
I want to see the unedited version
of this book. I think most people would. And I know already who would be first in court if they got the unedited version. But still. So what I've been doing is trying to make those connections locally and globally. I was in Uganda, in northern Gulu, where the Lord's Resistance Army were at their worst and had kidnapped child soldiers, who in turn, all men, kidnapped young women by Joseph Kony. And so I saw the outcomes of what it was like for those women who had been taken out of dormitories and schools to be forced into marriage with the men who had kidnapped them. And when they returned with their babies, they were shunned because of the norms that they were to blame somehow for their kidnapping and bearing children. I was in Bosnia and listening to the women talking about forced sex and the rapes, and the same in Rwanda. I was there last year, and it's 25 years since their genocide, and those women are still traumatized, and talked about the trauma of going through the courts in Arusha and Tanzania without any support, and being put through having to give their testimony without any backup. And I was in East Timor, where the Irish government has still got the conflict resolution unit that brought Liberia, East Timor and ourselves together. And one of the themes was violence against women and girls. And it was there that we talked about it, and I came across something I'd never discovered before, which was those women were sterilised, forcibly sterilised by the Indonesian army to prevent them from having children, so that they wouldn't have more children. Do you know that old debate in Northern Ireland, who outbreeds who? Yeah, we're familiar with it. and that forced sterilisation. So today, they won't use family planning because they still have this memory that that's where it comes from. And our cultural memory kind of scalds us, and it's scalding those women. And as a result, they're dying with maternal mortality, giving birth to too many children. Their families are about 10, 11, 12 because they're Portuguese colony and hence Catholics. And so that connection between war and religion and attitudes and misogyny. And down here in Northern Ireland, I did the study back in '92 and I repeated it with Jessica in 2016, where we looked at what difference does peace make? And the point of that was that everybody was saying that Northern Ireland had a spike after the peace agreement because we had the figures in domestic violence went up. It wasn't as a result of that. Yes, those men who use violence outside the home go back to women and children, and they don't, disconnect in terms of it, but not all men involved in our conflict were perpetrators. What was happening was that the women previously could not go to the police, and that was the difference. And they couldn't go to hospitals where it was busy dealing with bombs and amputations. So the spike, and I have to keep saying this, and I still have to keep saying it internationally, it happens before the war, it happens during the war, and it continues after the war. It is a continuum, not suddenly just up and down, and of course the figures do change seasonally, and because of COVID, Christmas, holidays, and indeed during lockdown, as Noel said to me, it was a perpetrator's dream if you could hear the woman's voice saying, he told me that I couldn't meet family and friends, and then suddenly the government said the same thing. And that, of course, is what women experience. They're on lockdown in domestic violence situations. So making those connections, I think, are really important, and that's why a strategy on violence against women is really important. And when we went to court and befriended women and tried to stand up in the courts, it was a one-off event. That was the difference now. It is now seen as a pattern. And that's really, really important. How many times do we sit in the magistrates' court and the judge saying, or the magistrate saying, I don't want to hear about what happened last month. I want you to tell me about what happened this night. And the woman would get tongue-tied because she couldn't put it in context. Context is everything. And that's where we managed to make a change in relation to the legislation, a pattern. And as you know, Geraldine, in relation to the men that you've been working with in probation, that's the most difficult thing of all. If you don't start early in what I was calling a career, and then I had to change that word because it has the wrong connotations, a career of abuse. If you don't intervene at an early stage, very hard to change it later on. And so, serial perpetrators is what we now know about, but were we able to talk about people being serial perpetrators? One of the court cases I attended in Antrim was of a young woman with cerebral palsy. I had to write to the court, to the PPS, and say, because they weren't going to prosecute. And the reason why they weren't going to prosecute was because they hadn't interviewed her. And it was just taken that she had cerebral palsy and wouldn't be a good witness. And her mother came to see me. It wasn't in my constituency. You know, Louise, that you're supposed to only work for the women in your constituency and men. And of course, probably one of the reasons why I lost my bloody seat in 2003 was I was working all over the place and not doing enough in my own territory. But as you will know, Rachel, the stuff you're working on, no doubt somebody's saying to you, you stick to North Down, girl, otherwise you're going to lose your seat at the next election. That's not how we work. And that's not how we work on this. And so in that court case, the PPS eventually agreed, when they interviewed her and saw that she could be competent and good for NSPCC, they were able to provide a befriend her during the court. I sat through that court and it was awful. It was as if she was on trial. And in fact, when she broke down, took an epileptic fit, the barrister defending, who had been at Queen's with me, actually when she returned after hospital that afternoon, again to give evidence, after the judge had said that she shouldn't be in the witness box in her wheelchair in case she created too much sympathy for the jury. And she was up against all that. She was only young, and it turned out he was a serial abuser. It was her stepfather, and they'd abused previously. None of that was allowed to come in, of course. And the barrister, who had been in the law faculty and law student at the same time as I was, I wanted to wring his neck that day. He got up and said, "Oh, so the prima donna's back. Oh, so the one who was able to give all this drama this morning." And the judge allowed it. A young woman with cerebral palsy sitting in the court with a befriender beside her, touching her shoulder every time her head drooped, kept giving the evidence. She lost the case. But I'm telling you that. And then her cousin took the case a few weeks later, because unless you have similar fact evidence, you cannot pursue it. And she wasn't able to talk about the time she was in women's aid. She wasn't able to talk about the cousin who had been babysitting, none of that. That has changed, but it still needs to go on, that pattern, if we are going to identify the abusers. What I was looking at when I was writing this book, this chapter on domestic violence, was the norms that we lived with and how we've changed that and how we still need to change it, the culture. And there again, Louise, is the issue in terms of Northern Ireland. Yes, we are a very conservative, patriarchal and potentially very still so-called religious society. And how many times do we hear you've made your bed, you lie in it? Or you keep the family together at all costs. One of the most nerve-wracking experiences I ever had was, people say I preach all the time, but I actually got to preach. And it was in a church and it was from a pulpit and I was given a sermon. Can you believe it? And it was a Pole class. It was in Pole class on a Sunday during Mass. And I thought,
didn't melt.
it was. Can you imagine? In 1993 or 94, and it was my cousin, Father Paddy, and it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been my cousin. And Father Paddy asked me, and I was shaking. But it led to change thinking. It led afterwards to Women's Aid, working with the churches, Home is Where the Heart Is, getting the pamphlets out. We have to remember that these are the frontline people. These are the people who create the culture, create the thinking, and can change the attitudes. And so if violent and toxic masculinities are made, they can be unmade. They can change, and that's what that work that Women's Aid and the agencies have had to do. And historically, and probably still in Northern Ireland, I was looking back to where that notion of the rule of thumb came from. You could hit a woman with a stick no thicker than her thumb, hence the rule of thumb. It was never actually in law, but it was actually quoted in courts. And it was permitted in law that you could chastise a woman with moderation. So moderation, where did moderation end? Where did it start? And that was, unfortunately, the legislation we were working with, which Rachel has managed with Women's Aid to change. The old Offences Against the Persons Act that did not take account of coercive control, did not take account of all the things that we were writing about back then and repeated again in 2016. The psychological abuse, the financial abuse, as well as the physical. And as Alison has been able to stand up in court and show the new types of abuse with technology. That we have to stay on top of this all the time, and hence the reason for a new strategy, a modern strategy. Because when I went back and looked at this, I thought, so much has changed and so much hasn't. But the techniques that men use to attack women and to get at women, and I'm talking about women because Sonya mentioned when I did the study and bringing it out in the open, it was the Department of Health and Social Services that asked us to do it. I tendered for it, put in it, and then they came back saying, but there are no men in this. And I said, well, this is where we're starting if we want to build on it. After it came out, there was such a blow up about it that it was all on women. They commissioned a report, I don't know if you remember this, Patricia, they commissioned a report on men. It was so bad they had to tear it up and throw it in the bin. And it was a waste of something like, which was big money for us then, 15,000, which was the same amount that I had been given to do or less, to do the bringing it out in the open and the follow-up with the court service and prosecution. And so that brings me to this notion about gender neutral. Is it benefiting us? No. And when I drafted helped draft the advice, both on the Good Friday Agreement and later in the Bill of Rights, you can't have neutrality where it is doing harm and where it doesn't see the consequences or it doesn't take on board the context. It needs to be gender specific. And when I went to the Public Prosecution Service and asked for the breakdown of the data in terms of who's getting prosecuted, it's interesting that Section 75 doesn't apply to the PPS. I didn't know that. It actually doesn't apply. I couldn't get the figures for nationality, for Catholics and Protestants, for the age groups, and yet this is the most important data that you can have. Information, education, agitation. And if you don't start with correct information, you'll not get the proper agitation coming out the other side. All you'll get is antiquated attitudes about who's doing it, or misinformation, that there's many men getting beaten up or attacked or assaulted or psychologically abused or financially abused As women, it's not the case, and we need to show that. We also need to show the differences between what happens to disabled women, elderly women, what happens to vulnerable women, ethnic minorities on visas, and what we did was included the traveller women. Because all of that's incredibly important when you're looking at this. And that's what we did, was make the connections and show the continuities. So, context is everything. I think Section 75 needs to be addressed in terms of that gender neutrality. It can't go on. It was there in the 90s after we introduced it in legislation. When I say we, the Equality Commission had to introduce it. And it's still there, and it's still working to the same. Because I worked with the DOJ, and I had to go back and rewrite, along with Jessica, we'd done this whole big report on how to train the court service, the police, and went round every one of those agencies, and they said, take back that report. You haven't put women and men, women and men, women and men into it. In fact, it never got published because the Assembly failed, and it didn't come back for 3 years. And the report's sitting. But at least when Judge Gillen went to look at the reforms on the rape case after the rugby trial, he did use it and said it was one of the most important. And what I was saying in it back then, and from 90s through the 2000s and now into 2021, it hasn't changed, that concept. And it does need to if we're going to look at a new strategy. So, fair play to Women's Aid. Way back, started the housing Grunja, squatted in it. We have a poster which is brilliant of Lord Melchett when the Labour government were here under direct rule. There was a poster behind him when he opened the refuge in Derry against the Republicans, saying, what are you inviting a direct rule minister from Westminster down to Derry for? And they went ahead and opened it, and there was a poster saying, women are abused because there's a lot of worms around, something like that. And it was really funny. I don't think the Northern Ireland office officials thought it was that funny. It was a pure accident that they had people standing under it. But that brings us back to what it was like, and I collected all those stories about housing. And what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, we need all the trauma counselling, we need the education for the children in the schools and the youth clubs, but we need housing. And that's where we're better than the United States. Because what I saw in the United States was they were putting a lot of private finance, and that's how they raise a lot of their money, into therapy and counselling, but not into the services. And when you deliver training and education to make a woman's life independent, but when you provide safe housing, that makes a huge difference. And that's where I think I probably stopped there. There was more to say, but I shouldn't have told so many stories. And there's a bit about human rights in there. Yeah. That's the other bit that changed. And again, as somebody who was the Chief Commissioner, I tried desperately, and still am, to get them to recognise that dignity and respect is also about not just our troubles in terms of the violence that went on, but the violence inside homes. Everybody wants to talk about the street violence and what happened publicly. But what happens in terms of intimate partner relationships is that it wasn't made public, and it still isn't, and therefore is more quietly kept in one side. So the Bill of Rights for me had to include the right of a woman and all to live independently with dignity and respect. And I had a piece in those rights about specifically around the issue of domestic violence and sexual violence, and it has never made its way to the light of day, nor has the Bill of Rights. But now with Brexit, Louise, it might, as a result of us not having the Human Rights Act being reduced by the Conservative government, and that will have huge implications for us in Northern Ireland because we have no constitutional rights. Unlike the Republic that at least has, we don't. And so the notion of, the right to life and the positive obligation of the police, and I know Bobby will probably talk about this, because the police didn't feel they had an obligation, a positive obligation back then, but do now as a result of the Human Rights Act. The state does have a duty and due diligence as a result being carried out, as you will know. And those are important, and they're not to be subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment. When we talked about torture in Northern Ireland, inhumane and degrading treatment, yes, the violations in terms of the families that disappeared and the human rights violations in terms of taking people's life, but also in terms of domestic violence. There were more women murdered here during those years by domestic violence than there were in the Troubles, shot dead because the place was awash with guns. So the weapons of the mind and the weapons in the hands actually were what were creating the problem. So today, I think what we have and what we need to build on is the sanctions, is the protections, but mostly too also the promotion of a different culture. And we're getting there, but very slowly. It's been a precarious process, been a very slow process, but it's because of the people in this panel that we have managed to get where we're at. So I want to pay tribute to Women's Aid. I want to tell the agencies and the services, they are the experts. They've been there for 50 years, they're still there. And I'll finish with a story from Noelle. In Women's Aid one day I was in the refuge and Noelle told me a woman had come in and Noelle was down in the kitchen and the woman said, "And how long have you been here?" And Noelle says, "About 30 years. And the woman says, "Oh dear God, does it take that long to get out?" End of story.
I'd just like to move over to Alison then, and as Sarah said, you know, you're reporting over the last over a year now, and that, so the impactful first cover that you had in your new role in the Belfast Telegraph was just, I actually held it up in our last evidence to Justice Committee on stalking. You know, this is it and this is a reality. So we thank you so much. But I just want to hand it over to yourself.
Before I had taken the job at the Belfast Telegraph, I, in my diary, had been writing at the back of it the names of all the women who had been killed during that period of time. Because of COVID and because the world's news was dominated by that, these murders were going completely unreported or underreported. And I wanted to know who these women were, and what had happened, to put a face, you know, to the name. And you don't know how any employer is gonna, you know, take you when you come in and suggest news stories. And when I suggested, I was so glad that they gave me the space and that they went out and sourced the photographs. And there had been 8 women who had been murdered since the start of lockdown. I think a lot of people were shocked. It was double the amount of the previous year. So you can see the impact that lockdown had. If you take it back just a couple of months before that, to the start of 2019, it's actually 11 women if you count in there, because we know then we had the murder of Giselle Herrera and our young daughter Alison Newry just before lockdown started. And those deaths, I think when you looked at the faces of those women and, you know, and the circumstances of each of those deaths, and almost all of those, they're live cases. But if you take and you count from the 11 at the start from 2019, of those 11 women, 5 were foreign nationals, or people who came here to make their home here, either women or girls. And if you take that into proportion of people from other places who live here, which is quite small, that is horrific. And that shows, you know, the vulnerability of women who don't have access to services or don't even know where to go looking for services, and who are also much more vulnerable in their own homes due to the fact that maybe their family live elsewhere, their friends live elsewhere, there can be language barriers, there's all sorts of issues that create a vulnerability there. And in one of those cases, the defendant in that case is using rough sex as a defence, which is something that shouldn't even be allowed in law, that anyone could go into court and claim that is part of a murder, you know. And the fact I know, and Rachel might speak about that, how there are steps to try and remove that and mean that it can't be used, but right now it can, and that's the defence that's going to run in that case. One of the other things that struck me when you're looking at those cases is, of course, when we look at them in their entirety, that things like housing are so important, because we live in a segregated society. You cannot just get up from your home if you have to flee it and move to X place because you might be the wrong religion to live in that place. That housing estate may not suit your children. You know, that's the problem that we have here with housing, and the problem that living in a conflict society creates, which doesn't particularly exist in other places in terms of where people can go to live, and then the paramilitary influence on that. So in a lot of cases, if the person being abused, if their abuser has connections to a paramilitary group, they're the one that has to leave the home and their area. They're the one who is stigmatised. And if you look at the way that housing points are allocated towards those women, it actually angers me and infuriates me. And I know the housing executive is here, but if you are a paramilitary figure who wants a new house, you just get one of your mates to threaten you, and you get intimidation points, and you get moved into a nice new build. But you don't get intimidation points for domestic abuse if you have to take your children and leave your home at 3 o'clock in the morning. Tough luck, go and live in a hostel until we can find you a new house. I know that Cailíní Cullen, when she was standing as minister, said that domestic abuse would now be counted in intimidation points. But as far as I know, that's not yet the case, and they're still working off the old system. So as of now, you're the person who has to leave. And then there's the coercion of paramilitaries into people, into getting them to withdraw statements. You know, there's cases of women that I have spoken to that have been, you know, promised that they would be given certain things by those paramilitary groups if they withdrew statements. In one case, and if to put this in context about how this wouldn't happen anywhere else, in one case there was a guy convicted of a paramilitary style shooting that happened 10 years before. the reason why he was convicted was because he had beaten his partner and smashed all the windows, and the police had arrested him. And when they arrested him, they took his DNA and it matched something that had happened before. And that woman then had to leave her home because clearly his conviction wouldn't have happened had she not phoned the police in relation to the domestic abuse. Where on earth else in the world, would you see that happening? I think that all of that's an important context. And I know that the police are here, but I have asked, before, and I still don't believe that is the case. There has to be a commitment in writing that anyone who has non-molestation orders, restraining orders against them, who is even, has been arrested for domestic abuse offences, that they will not be used as covert human agents. The fact that we still have people here working as informers, and that some of those informers are domestic abusers in their own homes, and yet using that to escape having to be subject to the full forces of the law, that's a disgrace. And also how then we move on to our family courts. As a reporter, I'm not allowed into the family courts, and that's rightly so, because that's to protect the children. These are important courts. They're not some sort of reality TV show that we should all be allowed to have access to. But having been in the family courts, both because I needed a non-molestation order myself, and also as a Mackenzie friend to a friend who had literally just run out of money and was about to lose her house because she had spent 3 years in a family court with an abuser who in most cases is entitled to legal aid because of no job, and a woman on the lowest of income is not entitled to that, and racks up debts of thousands and thousands of pounds trying to protect herself and her children from these abusers. In some cases, people who are not allowed by law to be, within the same street, or the same housing estate as the person they've abused, but can sit from here to here in the family court and spend all day glaring at someone and intimidate them that way, and do that as many times as they like without any constraints on the amount of what it costs them in terms of money, but it's still costing the person that they've abused money. As a Mackenzie friend sitting with my friend, I watched as a judge told her that she realised that her partner, who had no job and lived with his mother, might not be able to provide as good a home for her child, but that she would take the child off her and give her to him if she didn't allow him access to him. He had fractured her skull, he had hospitalised her, he smashed up her home on the day of her mother's funeral. Nothing to do with the child. The judge kept saying, that's your problem, that's between you and him, that's nothing to do with your child. Your child will see him and I will take him off and give him to him and you'll get access to him. Randomly that day, I was going through the court list to check for something else, and there pops up his name on the criminal court case, and I thought, my goodness, let's find out what he's done. Turns out he was in court for stabbing someone in the city centre. She had to go back and stand up herself and say, I know that he's in court for stabbing someone in the city centre. The solicitor's representing him in here is representing the criminal court, has made no mention of this, pretended it wasn't happening. The judge said, I want his criminal record checked. And the judge says, well, I want your criminal record checked. And she says, check it if you want, there's nothing on it. When we come back 2 weeks later, the judge, without apologising, said to her, this case is now closed, and your child can look at that file when he's 18 years of age if he wants, but until now that's the end and there could be no more brought back. I know from my experience, and the women in this room will know, that the only thing that could have been on his record that would have that case closed till he was 18 had to be sexual. It had to be something that put that child at risk. And that judge was not even going to check that. He was going to hand the child to him, take him from a good loving home and give him to that abuser. And that shows you the weaknesses that exist in our family court. In my own case, I ended up with thousands of pounds of debt for some head case, who, like in some cases, was taking big cases to the family court, saying that he wanted to get a bus past my work, and therefore I had to go around and spend a day off work sitting around there for that to take place. And all of this was allowed to clock up before a judge finally put an end to it. In those cases, the Gillen report said that if you wanted to be a defence solicitor and defend someone who was accused of a sexual crime, you should have to undergo specialist training before you're entitled to apply for legal aid to do that. And that was training in relation to rapists and all sorts of other things. That was one of Gillen's suggestions. I maintain that should be passed into the family court as well, because you have criminal solicitors and barristers who are representing people in the family courts. And there's family court solicitors who do an amazing job, but then you're taking people who are trained in criminal law, you're going into those very specialist courts and treating people like they're criminals, when in fact all this is an access hearing. And instead it's aggressive in the manner in which they use, the manner in which they're questioning people. They're not trained to be in those courts. They're treating people like criminals when they're not criminals. And if they want to go and collect legal aid to work in those courts, they should have to undergo specialist training and be specialist family court solicitors and barristers. I don't believe we should be having criminal lawyers and barristers operating in the family courts. It's not the place for them. They've no right to there's no place for it, and it's traumatising and re-traumatising. And in many cases, if a woman runs out of money, she's sitting there on her own trying to represent herself against a highly paid criminal barrister who's being paid in legal aid to cross-examine her. I mean, how on earth in any society is that fair? Or is that a fair way to run any justice system? I think in terms of the way that people speak about domestic abuse, we still have, you know, I did a panel with Sonya for Féile, it was 2 years ago now, last year, and we called it "Why Doesn't She Just Leave?" Because that is the thing that people most say to me, well, why didn't she just leave? What's she still there for? And I mean, all of the things that we spoke about in relation to housing and how do you move your children, how do you uproot them, how do you move them maybe to an area so far away that you've no family support, how do you get away from that coercion that exists in that relationship. And more importantly, as we know, the most dangerous time for any woman is when they do leave. That's when they're murdered. You know, that is when when things escalate to that point. And in terms of that's where I think people like me have a role to play, because how the media reports on domestic abuse, how it reports on femicide, how it reports on all of those things can be just as damaging in terms of how society views those issues. So we still have, you know, newspapers who use, you know, man snaps after wife has affair with younger man. You know, this is someone might chop someone's head off with a hatchet, but he's just snapped. You know, he snapped because she was on an affair. You know, we still see the headline given the excuse, the defence, before it gives actually issues. In some cases, I've read stories where I have been 3 or 4 paragraphs down before the woman's name even appears in the story, as if she's some sort of side issue to this, you know, tale of this poor wronged human being, God bless him, you know, who was under such pressure he had to murder somebody. And those are the kind of reports that I think that we really need to move away from, and those myths. I was going through the archives of the paper one day looking for something I was doing in relation to historical abuse inquiry, and I came across this tiny little court report which was this size in the paper, and it was how I think it was either 12 or 13 men in North Belfast had been fined for continually raping 2 sisters who were 12 and 13. And the court report said that the mother would have parties in the house, and when the men had drink on them, and this was actually said in court, the young girls who were well versed in the art of sex were only too willing to oblige them. And that's what it said. Now, I know when I'm telling you to go, that must have been the 1920s or 1930s. That court report was from 1989. And there are times I have been lying in bed wondering where those wee girls are.
Yeah.
Where are they now? Are they even still alive? Do you imagine at 12 or 13 that happened to you and someone was given a fine because they were told it was your fault? You know, and that is not, I mean, that is in our lifetimes. That is not something that happened a long time ago. That was the year of the Good Friday Agreement. That was the year when these negotiations were going on about our future. And yet that was the year that these things were
89
happening.
or 99?
89, sorry, 89, this was 89, sorry. This was the day, 89, yes, I'm talking about 6 hours now. Don't blame the Good Friday. So all of these things were going on at the time, you know, when I would have been a teenager, and that could have easily been any of us that was in that court, but that was a judge's attitude of very young women at that time, children. And what we still have to do is try and move away from those stereotypes that we use. So things like child porn, which, you know, isn't a phrase, let's face it, but yet is used constantly in terms, we try to find a different way to use the term of revenge porn, because revenge porn means that you did something and so you have to be punished for it, rather than the fact that you're just, you know, being abused by someone. One of the other things as a journalist that I find really frustrating is that those new laws about the communications and misuse of communications in terms of printing, publishing pictures, and that is how social media has now become a huge part of how women are abused, and there's no escaping from that. I mean, why doesn't she just leave? Well, you can leave and go and live in another country and still be abused using social media, and you cannot escape that. And, you know, I think especially for women who have older children or teenage children, that could be more distressing than anything, because your children are seeing this abuse, they're looking at it, they're reading these horrific things about their own mother, and what the law can do in terms of that, I found, you know, is really, really poor in terms of how they deal with that. But also, if you're a victim of a sexual crime, regardless of whether the person is found guilty or not, you have lifelong anonymity. I cannot name you in a newspaper unless you agree to be named. It doesn't matter whether a jury believes you or not, you still have anonymity for the rest of your life. You don't have that in terms of those communication sexual offences, which means I know a lot of women who have withdrew their statements because they have said that'll damage me professionally, that'll damage me in terms of, you know, my family will see that, my children will see that. So men are getting away with this because the victims are too afraid in case they appear in a newspaper saying that these pictures were shared of them. I mean, that's a no-brainer that you should have anonymity in terms of that offence. It's a sexually motivated offence. I think in terms of how we move forward. I mean, I think that there is, all of us here, I think are the method at which we work and how you've worked in the study that you've done, how Women's Aid have worked, it has all changed so dramatically because our society has changed so dramatically. How people meet each other has changed. You know, people who are meeting each other online who have no notion of who that person is. You know, years ago, if, you know, people met at a couple, they would know that person's family or background or someone related to them. Now you have serial abusers who are able to bounce around using the internet, using online dating to target different women and to target increasingly vulnerable women. When we talk about repeat abusers, I have a couple of names who I watch the court lists for quite regularly, and they appear at times for some of the most horrendous crimes, and you wonder, why are they still out? Why are they still walking the streets? In one case, there's a guy going through the courts at the minute, and I previously reported on a case where he took his ex-partner hostage. He held her for 3 days, he shaved her head, he beat her to the point where she was unrecognisable, he continually raped her. He was convicted of assaulting her but not raping her because he said she consented to that while she was having her head shaved. And he is currently going through the court system again for a completely different woman, a completely different set of abuse. And I think that, you know, in terms of the sentencing of those people, once you reach that threshold, why they're still being sent to the magistrate's court when the magistrate is limited into what sentence they can give you. So regardless of whether the additional abuse on your latest victim is on the lower scale, that person should be immediately sent to the Crown Court because there's a pattern of behaviour there and they're a danger to women. So why are the PPSN not recommend to send them to the Crown Court where they can get like a minimum sentence of 5 years instead of getting 18 months, which is all the magistrate's ever going to be able to give them anyway. There are so many small parts of our criminal justice and I don't think people understand how they work. I don't want to, you know, Gráinne's work with the housing executive is very specific, but when I tell people how you're awarded intimidation points, they still look at me as if I'm not wise. So basically, you are intimidated from your home, you'd report that to the police, to the housing executive, they go back to an organisation called Base 2, who goes and asks the paramilitary group who abused who removed you from your home, did you remove that person from their home? And they either say yes or no, and then they carry it back. And that's whether they judge whether you need intimidation points. Last year I reported a case in South Belfast where the woman had reported a local paramilitary to police who was threatening her children. They wanted her out of the area. So instead they brought her ex-partner, who was a member of that paramilitary group around, who beat her up in the path of the house for the whole house and estate to see. And then they said, oh no, we didn't tell her to leave, that's a domestic situation, that was her ex-partner, and refused to confirm that she'd been intimidated from the area, so therefore she couldn't get intimidation points. So they were asking the people who'd removed her from her house, did they remove her from her house? And they just kept saying, no, she can go back if she wants, when clearly she couldn't. And that is the issues that we have in terms of domestic abuse in our housing sector that don't exist in any other part of these islands. You know, I know how difficult it is to get social housing anywhere, but no one has to face that kind of barriers when they're trying to get social housing. No one has to experience being removed from their home by a paramilitary group who actually sends a member of the paramilitary group who's a former partner around to beat them up and remove them so that they can pretend it was a domestic dispute and not a paramilitary one. I don't think that would happen anywhere else. I am very keen to get anywhere that I work to try and abide by the guidelines in terms of reporting, that we can try and change that, because it's the only way we're ever going to change society's attitude. That's an uphill battle in some ways, you know, despite the fact that there's so many high profile women in the media now, it's still quite a sort of patriarchal society, you know, quite a patriarchal industry. We will change it slowly. And what I would say, I suppose, finally, is when we talk about this being gendered, I'm in like a group chat and we joke that if any of us put anything on social media about violence against women, you know, if you watch Countdown, it goes dun 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 dun. Well, before it gets to that, somebody will tweet underneath it. But what about men? But what about this? But what about that? Not all men, and we joke how quickly, and we have like a prize for the person who shows up quickest, and sometimes it could be there in 20 seconds. I mean, it's like an alarm goes off somewhere, quick, you know, rally troops, there's a woman talking about violence, we need to go on and abuse and ask about men. And that's how the issue needs to be treated properly. See, there's nonsense about, oh, you can't say this is an offence against women without mentioning men. We need to be honest about the conversation. In the back of my diary where I count up all the women who have been murdered in their own homes during that time, I decided to do a similar list for men, and in that time there's been one. And that's the difference in the two situations. So there's 11 to 1. And the one would actually be quite rare, because if you take that in context of most years, most of the men who are murdered by other men. And that's the truth. And I think that's the truth that we need to hammer home.
So no, that's absolutely delighted to be with you this afternoon. Thanks for extending the invite to discuss, what for me is a really critical issue for contemporary policing. I think it's really interesting, against the backdrop where overall crime numbers may have gone down. I think what's really clear to us is that the nature of crime is changing in a really concerning way. So we're seeing increased levels of reported violence, sexual offences in particular. But it's when you get beneath those figures again and you do explore them specifically in terms of gender that I think we see real cause for concern. Because what we are seeing within those figures is that reported crime against women is increasing. As I've said, it is becoming more violent as well. And we now find ourselves in a position where for the second year running, since we started to look at gender as a breakdown in terms of reported crime, women and girls are now statistically more likely to be victims of crime than their male counterparts. They're also more likely to be the biggest cohort of repeat victims of crime as well. So they're about 20% of women will be repeat victims compared to 15% of males. And the key question in all this, I think, for me is this a reflection of increased levels of crime against women and girls, or actually is what we're seeing the result of increased reporting of crimes and offences that have always been there, but we're now getting a better understanding of what's going on. And I guess in that respect as well, we've got to be conscious of the fact that even still, you're probably talking like somewhere in the region of like 60% of crime probably still goes unreported. So just how true a reflection that is of the scale of the problem, we clearly need to do more work with our partners to be able to properly understand that. So it's a massive concern for us as an organisation. Obviously, the executive are developing their own violence against women and girls strategy, and we in the PSNI will be adopting a similar approach. In fact, I've just planned to have a listening event with a broad range of stakeholders this year, where we hope to hear from them what they need from the police. And the thing that's been really clear as well, in particular following the death of Sarah Moore, that there are very serious questions for the police to answer in terms of their existing approach, in terms of the support that they provide to victims in particular, but also the community at large. And we as an organisation are in no means complacent around this. We have done a lot of work over the last number of years, specifically in the field of domestic abuse, which contributes to a significant amount of the crime against women and girls. But we know that there's a great deal more that we can do, more that we can do working in partnership with the community and with other advocacy and stakeholder groups to be able to deliver a far better community safety response to what, as I've said, is a very important and significant issue for us.
Can you just
Thank you so much. I'm not on the panel, Sarah Mason from Women's Aid, but you can't see Sonya, so it's a bit unfair to have a voice with no head from the sideline. We really appreciate you being here. Are you happy to remain on the screen while the other panel speak? I know you were short of time, but we really appreciate the input today. I'm really thrilled to hear the police are starting to look at it. And what I would say or ask is that ensure Women's Aid are around those tables. We need the experts, the subject matter experts around those tables, and we've already agreed to meet and discuss it. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you. Sonya, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd just like to, get your opinion on how you think we could move forward with this.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I was quite surprised to get like an email and then sort of seeing who else was on the panel and sort of go, what am I doing here? But no, thank you so much. Yeah, as Sonya said, I've been working, I was a member of the Justice Committee when the Assembly reformed, but I still count myself as quite new. I haven't been in post yet 2 years, so still trying to learn everything. So it was sort of thrown in the deep end then with the first bill that the committee was looking at was the domestic abuse bill. Obviously the bill had been in formation for a very long time, date back to Claire Sugden when she was Justice Minister. And then the Assembly being down for 3 years was just another example of how women in society here were being failed by government and by the political parties here. So it was just, it was something really, really important for me to get stuck into, as it was so important. And we did a lot of work, as Sonya said. Sonia's been in front of our committee I don't know how many times, and thank you. It's an open door policy, I suppose. And I have to say, count myself as a wee bit of a troublemaker. Don't really take this culture of no well, and there was a lot of no's from the very beginning. No, you can't do that. No, we can't look at that. No, that's not within scope. No, that's not for now. No, that's not for this department. And it was very, very annoying for a new member such as myself to try and get my head around that we're actually creating legislation, you know, without resourcing, without a strategy, gender neutral, on something that is so gendered, that we had no data collection, with no reporting requirement, and no, can we have that in there? No. Why not? Because that it doesn't work, and it doesn't work for women, and it doesn't work for victims. So I definitely did a bit of poking and prodding and amendments, and I was really actually glad and said about working with the committee. You know, I have to say, I didn't think that Paul Frew and myself would be sitting in a room discussing about, you know, well, how much trouble can we cause. It was certainly as a strange partnership, but was certainly and Paul Gibbon as well, to give him his due. You know, we're sitting and chatting about what we can, you know, what we're going to do, and sort of supporting my amendments and things like that. So there was so much to consider with the new domestic abuse legislation, but it was the first time, as we've said, you know, that recognising a pattern of abuse, and also that coercive control was going to be criminalised, because that hadn't happened here. We didn't have it, but also about trying to making sure that people understood what coercive control is, and I think that is going to be a real challenge for us as well, because we're still talking about, you know, the physical abuse. We're not talking about, and I'm not including anybody in this room, we all know what it is, but about what that actually looks like. And having to go on Stephen Nolan's show with Jim Allister and try and tell Jim Allister that what he was saying is actually an example of coercive control. You know, he was just talking about, you know, very legal terms, and our legal system is obviously going to have to catch up to the experiences of women and experience of victims, and whenever this legislation is finally rolled out, which I believe the end of February hopefully will be starting, the regulations will be rolled out fully. But we've a lot to do, and without resourcing, both financial and time, and making sure that everybody understands and is on the same page, this is going to go nowhere, this legislation. It's going to be the same with the Stalking Bill and the Justice Bill that we're working on as well. Without actual resources and buy-in and ring fencing of funding and committed funding over long term, this is going to go nowhere. It's going to get gathered dust on a shelf, just like everything else has as well. And we've got an opportunity, I think, with the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, is to kind of counter the issues that the legislation won't. And it has to be executive led. It cannot be down to one department. It just cannot do that. There is so much that we wanted to do, and as Sonya knows, in the domestic abuse bill, was look at housing, was look at benefits, was looking at social security, was looking at poverty. We're looking at all of those sort of things that we couldn't because of scope. And I did try and add in an amendment on getting a Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and of course that didn't meet scope. We tried on Section 75, which is crucially important. It was only myself and People Before Profit that ended up voting for that, which was, you know, obviously then that was three votes out of 90, which was very annoying. But there was all of these barriers being put up. No, we can't report on Section 75. Well, then you're misunderstanding Section 75 then. So we're still got a long way to go. And having a gendered, a Violence Against Women and Girls strategy for Northern Ireland, has to come in. It has to happen. It has to be led by the Executive Office, and it must be resourced. Otherwise, what is the point? We have so much to do on data collection and reporting, which is why I put that in to, and it was great to see the committee had agreed on that, and having that, trying to get that reporting through from the moment of reporting to the PSNI to outcomes from court, and having that being reported in the same way, because otherwise we're looking at all these different things and you're not being able to see it, you know, in front of you. And also that would, you know, help with PSNI, would help with the, like, for my job as well, is trying to scrutinise all of this. Where do you get your information from? What else have we got? A lot to do. Monitoring as well, we put that in to the domestic abuse bill, and certainly I'd be looking to, no spoilers, the stalking bill will also try and have that in. You know, we're going to try it again. But also we've got a big way to go in terms of understanding about coercive control, as I said, but also about education, and this is fundamental again, why it needs to come from Executive Office in any strategy. We have no RSE education in Northern Ireland that is suitable We do not understand what a healthy relationship is. If we are not taught this from a young age, how on earth are we supposed to know as adults? How are adults supposed to know? And I know that that is a long-term sort of goal to have, and it doesn't really address the now. But are we going to continue this generational education that violence against women and abuse of women is okay? Because that's what we're being taught, and no one's countering that. So we can't have this sort of, oh, well, we'll have some RSE in this school, but maybe not here, or we'll teach that according to an ethos. No, this needs to be mandatory. It needs to be across the board, and it has to be taught in the same way, age appropriate for everybody. And every child and young person needs to know what a healthy relationship looks like and what a healthy relationship does not look like, and be able to recognise signs. And that is another big thing for me to be working on in the next, well, I've got a number of months left before the election, hopefully in the next mandate as well. But we have a lot of opportunities. Legal aid has been mentioned, and the courts. This was one of my, I'm sure there's probably little dolls made out of me with pins in it in certain areas of the departments. But what I wanted to take away from working on the domestic abuse legislation is the challenges that women face, and it is when we need to call that's what it is. It's women and children face within the family courts. So I don't know when it's going to be implemented, but we're been kind of kicked down the line a wee bit. But there is an amendment that was successful on the domestic abuse bill, brought by myself and thankfully supported at consideration stage. It did fall at a further consideration stage, about having a waiver for women or victims of domestic abuse. Again, it's gender neutral, but this is what we're talking about. A waiver for the Director of Legal Aid Services to apply in cases of domestic abuse and child contact orders. So that's written down in primary legislation. That is there. It hasn't been commenced yet. There was a lot of drama kicked up about that. Do you remember that? I was tearing my hair out, to be honest. I try not to swear at the time, but we know, Women's Aid know, from back in 2015, 1 in 5 women don't have access to legal aid, but that'll be more now, and the impact of pandemic and people losing their jobs, and we know that costs are going up. But waivers do exist. It already exists in legislation. So we're trying to sort of increase that access to justice for people as well. And if we are really, really going to deal with coercive control and financial abuse, we have to recognise that you might, be on a certain amount of money, but you can't afford access, you can't afford justice, you can't afford representation. And also, if somebody is manipulating you financially, it might look as if you're absolutely loaded, but you don't actually have anything. And I represent an area which has got traditionally seen as the Gold Coast, but let me tell you, it's not like that. It's really, really not like that. So you might be, oh, well, that person is from a very well-off background. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to get representation. So we looked at that, and we also changed, or got an amendment in to reflect the Scottish legislation, the so-called gold standard, with the impact of domestic abuse on children. So the child doesn't actually have to be present or witness abuse for children to be affected, and we all know that. So there's lots of things that we need to be doing. Gender neutrality, we just can't continue like that. That stopping domestic and sexual abuse strategy is not fit for purpose. We need to recognise as well the impact of pandemic, and as I say, Women's Aid have been doing a great job in terms of the Unlock Your Lockdown campaign. But we need to recognise the long-term effects of that, and that home was not the safe place, and I think that brought a lot of people into perspective. It brought in perspective for a lot of people. But we're not starting from scratch. Scotland and England and Wales have already got this. We don't need to. We're not making this up. We're not, leading the way, as it were. We should be, but we're not. So we know what we need to do. Education is key. Resourcing is key. Housing is key. We weren't able to put it in, but I'm also looking at then, as a private member's bill that I'm hopefully submitting in 2 weeks' time, if allowed, is legislating to have paid domestic abuse leave. So if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you have 10 days of safe leave from work. Because we don't have that. Unfortunately, the Conservative government didn't think to put that in their strategy. But that is something that we are going to be bringing in, hopefully, for Northern Ireland. Hopefully, all the other political parties will be on board. But that is something that we're looking at because we couldn't get it into this bill. We also don't have a domestic abuse commissioner, despite attempts. That didn't meet scope either. Lots of these things didn't meet scope, but we're gonna keep going on that. So all of those things from a strategy, we can put that in, and it can be Northern Ireland specific, and it needs to cover things like the anti-poverty strategy that's currently been designed. Where's the impact of poverty and inequality in this? Like, we need to look at that in Northern Ireland specific. Where's education? Where is the mental health and addiction and all of those side issues? But it's not side issues. This is fundamental part of domestic abuse and coercive control and violence against women, and that's both from victim and survivor, but also from perpetrator. So there's so much to do, but it's really, really good that we have this now. So it's about implementing it, and it's up to everybody that's involved to be on board with that and push that as much as possible. And I have loads to say, but I'm going to leave that. She can't really shut up.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So housing has been brought up on several occasions, and so I will hand it over now to Gráinne Long, the Chief Executive for the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. And as Sarah said at the start of our event this morning, you know, the Housing Executive is fundamental as the biggest funder of domestic abuse services here in Northern Ireland, and always such a great supporter, you know, even whenever we funded the helpline and whenever we had the helpline in service. So over to yourself, Gráinne, to see where the Housing Executive would fit into this strategy.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along. Oh, God, you know what? I always learn something. It doesn't matter how many times I listen to Monica, I sit and I think, right, keep scribbling, keep taking notes. You know, for 25 years, Monica, I've been learning from you, so thank you. And I also feel like it's a day out, like a proper, you know, morning out of the house. So, look, just to say thank you for inviting me along. And there was no question when the invite came. There was just no question that I would want to be here. I've been in post since the 1st of April, so it's my first job in the Housing Executive. But interestingly, I spent previous to this about 20 years working in housing. But I always say that actually the job that I learned most about housing, interestingly, was when I was Chief Executive of the ISPCC, which is the sister organisation to the NSPCC here. And the ISPCC, this is in the Republic of Ireland. And when I joined the ISPCC, so as I say, housing professional, and housing's quite logical in a way. You know, you pull one lever, it has an effect over here and so on. But people talk about the science and the art of housing, and I like that phrase because science really isn't about logic. It's about emotion, okay? And if you do housing well, you get the balance right between the science, which is how you build it, how you finance it. But the art is about the people in the homes, and what happens to those people. And that's why I love being a housing professional and why I'm a bit of a housing nerd. But when I joined the ISPCC, I learned more about housing in 4 years in a children's organisation. So when I left, the first thing I did, and I'm not genuinely not just saying it to this audience, you can check with the research team. But in my first day in the Housing Executive, I sent an email to our head of research and I said, how many children live in our homes? Because the Housing Executive is a really wonderful organisation. I'm not just saying it. But actually, it's also a really odd organisation in lots of ways because it's a housing authority, so it's an arm's length body. So we're a housing authority, but we're also an absolutely massive landlord. I mean, massive by any standard. In fact, I think the Housing Executive is still the biggest public sector landlord in Europe. And we might be the biggest public sector landlord in the world. I don't know, but we are certainly the biggest public sector landlord in any other country that I've done any work in, and certainly on these islands. So that makes it a really unique organisation, but it makes my job, you know, a huge responsibility, of which I'm well aware. But I thought it was really important that I came in on the first day and didn't sit down and look at the science of housing, that I got straight into the art. I wanted to know how many children live in our homes. And the reason I asked that is the first responsibility of a landlord is to keep people safe, warm and dry. Okay, that's it. And you build from that, okay? You keep people safe, you keep people warm, you keep people dry. Now you can expand beyond that, of course. But there are basics to housing management. So part of the reason I came along today is, and I didn't just come along because we're a funder, because that's not, I mean, that's incredibly important to women's aid, but that's not the most important thing we do. My job is to make sure that I keep 18,000 children and young people safe, warm and dry in their homes. But also I need to make absolutely sure that in doing that, we go as far beyond that as we can, okay? So that's why I came today, because I wanted to listen, I wanted to learn. So there's a responsibility and obligation to be a landlord. But what I learned from the ISPCC actually is that when you listen to children, the profound effect of violence on their lives, on their life, exactly those 12-year-olds. Where are they? What kind of lives do they have they lived because of the violence that was perpetrated on them? And so I sat in Childline in the ISPCC as the chief exec, but you have to sit, you have to listen. And you have to learn how to listen as well. So it took me quite a while in the ISPCC to learn how to listen to children. And when you say to a child, how does it make you feel? That it's often followed by a silence. Because you might be the first adult who have ever asked that child, how does that make you feel? We don't ask children that. So you have to give children sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes 3 years before they answer that question. So I learned how to do that. I learned how to do that by learning from our volunteers. But coming into this job, what's really, really important to me, and what I now have to spend time working with my 3,200 colleagues, is to understand that yes, we are a landlord, but we have to go beyond the science and we have to go into the art of what happens in those homes and what can we do. And we can't do everything, and we shouldn't. We have to get the balance right. I mean, we can't interfere, but actually what we can do is to make sure, are we meeting that first principle? Are we keeping people safe, warm and dry? So we have to be a landlord as well as a funder. And I think that's really important, because I think when the invite came in, it was really interesting. It tells you a lot about the culture of the organisation. And the invite came in and I said, yes, I'm delighted to do that. And they said, we'll get you all the funding information. And I thought, well, that's fine. You can crank that out. But actually, I want to know, what are we doing as an organisation culturally? So some of the things that you said earlier on, why doesn't she leave? Has anyone in my organisation asked that of a tenant? And if they have, I want to make sure that never happens again. And even if they don't say it explicitly, is that what they're thinking? Are they thinking that? Are they thinking, why doesn't she leave? Are they thinking, maybe it's her fault, maybe it's their fault, maybe the children don't count. So that's my job. I have to now get under the skin of the organisation, being in there a few months, and start to ask those questions. I suppose what I would say, and I also spent 2 terms as a Human Rights Commissioner, as a member of the Human Rights Commission, and that was hugely helpful to me in this job. But can I speak personally on this? From my experience, and I spent 2 years in the Equality Commission as Director of Policy, Section 75 was never meant to stop or inhibit strategies that were about direct intervention. Because Section 75 is about positive obligations, and human rights is about progressive realisation. It's never about holding back, it's about doing. And I spent 2 years writing guidance, and I don't recognise that. So something has shifted, hasn't it? Something has changed, that we're not really realising that the opportunity that Section 75 was about, and I think still is about, should be about. So what can the Housing Executive do, and what should the Housing Executive do? I'm sitting here today thinking, listening, and the idea of a strategy on violence against women and girls is wonderful, but it's not radical. And no one here has said it's radical. It's, so I'm not going away from this thinking, right, well, I'll wait for it to come. And when someone knocks on my door someday and says, now, here you go, I think organisations like us need to assume that it's in place from here, and need to start preparing for it and acting on it and doing it. And I have to say, from what I've found in the Housing Executive, it is an organisation where there are pockets of absolute brilliance, where I can absolutely tell you right now, there are people who are acting as if that strategy is here and in the here and now. I have to make sure it's across the piece, of course. But what are some of the things, I was thinking, as I was listening to you, well, what are some of the things that we ought to do? So I have a briefing that's all about funding. I'm not talking about that. But I'm sure you want to talk to me about funding, but we can certainly do. But what could the Housing Executive start to do tomorrow, Monday morning, that starts to give effect to a strategy on violence against women and girls? Well, first of all, we can ensure better reporting through our housing management system. So if I was to go back to the office now and open up our housing management system and say, can I find what I need to find? Well, I need to make sure that we can do that. And you're absolutely right, Rachel. I suspect that there are a whole range of organisations that don't have the right systems in place. So the question I ask, and again, as somebody who's been in housing for a number of years, is, do we do housing onto people, or do we take our systems and bend them towards the customer? And that's what I'm trying to do in the Housing Executive. Are we really genuinely meeting the needs of the customer? And lots of people asked me this week, what happened that you spent 3 days on Stephen Nolan? Well, actually, the question I asked the team is, did we take the word of a contractor over the word of an elderly lady. So the review that we're now doing is to answer that question. And that will tell me a lot about the organisation. And actually there are times when it's right to take the view of a contractor over the word of somebody if it's keeping them safe. So quite often we find it's quite difficult to get into people's homes to carry out gas inspections, for example. So you have to take there's a technical reason why you have to, but actually by and large, we all know where the balance is. The customer, you think about who's the person in the home, back to the art, not the science. So what else could we do immediately? Well, of course we need to ensure appropriate accommodation. But one of the pieces of data I got just in my briefing, there's an undersupply of 648 units right now today. So the strategic needs assessment that we did, now you all know this because you live it and breathe it and you see it, but 648 homes are needed across Northern Ireland to meet the needs of women and girls and families affected by domestic abuse. And the bad news, I'm sorry to say, is that we expect that that's going to increase to 919 units. So there's 1,000 homes, additional homes that we need to meet the needs of families who are affected by domestic abuse. So we have to start from there. There's another very big piece of work. We have to ensure and enable women and girls to stay secure tenants. Security of tenure. When you ask people what's the most important thing that you need, I need to be secure. And that safe, warm and dry means safe and secure and warm and dry. So there's a big piece of work, and I know it's ongoing at a policy level. But my first job was in Housing Rights Service, and if you told me when was that 2000, that I'd be sitting on a panel with Monica Williams and others, fabulous women, and we're still talking about why do women and girls, why do we have to say that women and girls should have security of tenure? My goodness me. I'm not going to depress us all, but please, my goodness. Can we not be here in 20 years, having the same conversation? So anyway, we have to get there on that. Supporting people funding, 72.8 million. And we were very lucky in Northern Ireland, 72.8 million is a lot of money on housing support services. But are we ensuring that all of that funding that goes towards women and girls affected by domestic abuse is having the right effect? So are we funding and funding and funding, or are we targeting and getting in the right place? That's a big question, big question. But no woman or girl should lose security of tenure. These are basics. Go back to the point about this is about a human rights-based approach to housing. These are basic human rights. This is not radical stuff. It's not radical stuff. It shouldn't be radical. And to come back to the point about yes, Alison, you're absolutely right. We have to look in fundamental terms at how we allocate housing. Okay. So we have an undersupply of social housing, as we all know. There's a structural gap now between demand and supply. So the gap has widened and is widening so far that something has to give. We have to do something different rather than just adding to supply every year. Okay, so we know that. But that's not an excuse. It explains why, I think, we've ended up with the system that we have. But it shouldn't excuse it. And so we have an opportunity now. The Minister made a decision on a review of allocations. We've been asked as the Housing Authority to implement that review of allocations. There is a part of it that is about looking at intimidation points, but we cannot lose this opportunity now to say, are we getting this right? Is the system bending towards everybody, including women and girls and anyone affected by domestic abuse? But are we going to bend the system now towards, and so we have an opportunity to do that. It's not going to be easy. And I can tell you right now, here's the one thing I can guarantee, we'll get some of this wrong. And we're going to have to take some risks on the way to do this. And then if we admit it, then we'll change it. Because how we allocate scarce public resources like housing is just, it's one of the most important, it is the most important thing that this organisation does, other than build it, which I want to be able to do, but that's for another day. And I suppose finally then to say, so before I came here, I said to the team, if I was to turn up at an event and I was to say that as of Monday, we'll start working on a paper that will start delivering on a strategy on violence against women and girls, what would you do? And thankfully, they said, well, I think you should just do that. And then we'll figure it out. So on Tuesday morning, we'll have a discussion on the executive team and we will start to act as if there is a strategy on violence against women and girls. Right. But if we did that, I know that's very nice. They're all very nice, thank you, but it's not radical. Wow. It's not radical. It's kind of what we should be doing, isn't it? As you say, Rachel, there's a lot to do. So look, we get on with it, and we'll get some of it right, we'll get some of it wrong, and you tell us when we get it wrong, but we're partners, so we'll get on from there. So thank you very much, that was a great thing.
Thank you so much for that. So it's over to the floor now at long last. So thank you so much. I think everyone has so much to say, maybe because we haven't got out for a while. Talk and be heard. But it's really over to the floor for anyone who has any questions for the panel or any comments. Do you want to share that?
I don't mind. Can I just check with you, ACC Singleton? Can you hear us okay? And yeah, okay. Anyone want to take the first jump at a question here today?
Well, I just want to make a comment really.
Yeah.
It's so uplifting really just to be here, and I mean I've been involved in Women's Aid a lot of years, and thank you all, and it's really positive thinking even though what we're working with is not good stuff. So thank you very much.
Right, we have Jenny Piper. Do you want to just?
Yeah, sure. So mine's a comment as well. So for those that don't know me, I'm Jenny Piper. I am head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service for another 18 days. Who's counting? But I'm really pleased that on my right is my successor, Dr. Jane Brady, who takes up the Hawks seat with effect from the 1st of September. I've kept it nice and warm. I think you should take some comfort from the fact that we're both here today. I'm the first woman to have occupied that Hawks seat in the 100-year history of Northern Ireland. Interestingly, I was a career civil servant, very different to Jane's background. And I remember speaking at an event and talking about, was trying to be fairly lighthearted about my experiences, and I talked about having spent most of my career working amongst men in 50 Shades of Grey. And the abuse and criticism that I got for that lighthearted comment, which was not particularly radical. We always talk about civil service being men in grey suits and so on. I got a significant amount of abuse online and so on, and I thought, how sad is that? Mm-hmm. Here I am, in a fantastic job, leading 23,000 civil servants, and people can't actually even see that there was a little tinge of attempt to have a little bit of humour there. It's all right sometimes for men to say things like that, but for a woman to attempt it. But anyway, that's just my little personal story. I wanted to say how pleased both Jane and I are to be here this morning. It was great to get the invitation, and it's wonderful to be in such a positive and enthusiastic event, but very humbling as well, incredibly humbling, and frankly quite daunting whenever you think about all of the challenges. We've come a long way, but we've an awful lot still to do. And as you rightly say, this is not rocket science. This is not radical. There's a bit of JFDI here, and I understand that's where many of you are, and understandably so. So I really just wanted to say I'm here and Jane is here as evidence of the executive's commitment to tackling violence against women and girls. It may have come forward slowly, much more slowly than many of you and many of us would have wanted, but it's there, and it's written into the COVID recovery strategy. And I know it's written in because I wrote it. So it's there as a commitment in the recovery strategy, recovery plan from COVID, which is due to really take us forward from now for the next 12 into 24 months, when the programme for government will come forward with all of its outcomes for the longer term, an executive strategy for the longer term. So it's got to start now, and the strategy, the development of the executive strategy on violence against women and girls is starting now. There's a lot of work, and Jane has got the briefing, so there's a lot of work has been done already. There are some tricky issues to overcome, and that issue of gender neutrality is quite a thorny one and quite a difficult one for some of the departments to get their heads around. But coming along to events like this just reinforces the importance of targeted approach, but also of joined up approaches. This is not a justice issue. This is not a Department for Communities issue. This is not a health issue. This is not an education issue. It is all of those issues. And these are tricky issues, thorny issues, but they're not radical. And we just need to keep saying that. And it was great to hear you, Monica, talking about your experiences, and you reminded me of Tony Beaton, and I worked with Tony. He was in the Northern Ireland office, private office at the time. I was in David Féile's private office and worked closely with him, and I remember that phrase so well. We live in an armed patriarchy. Haven't heard that for so long. And as you think about the work that the Independent Reporting Commission is doing, and Jane and I met with Monica and the IRC earlier this week on tackling paramilitarism, of getting joined up, integrated, holistic approaches that aren't just about the justice response or the police response, but are actually about tackling the roots of paramilitarism and the impacts of paramilitarism. The huge overlap that there is between violence against women and girls and tackling paramilitarism and getting it joined up and mainstreamed. Well, there are models and examples and lessons there as to how we need to approach the strategy on violence against women and girls. So the work has started. We're going to be talking much more with Women's Aid as the experts around all of this. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We want to learn from those jurisdictions that have already developed the strategy. I'm a big fan. I'm of an era when Blue Peter was the programme you had to watch. So I'm very happy to take the Valerie Singleton version. Here's one I made earlier, and make sure that it's targeted and fit for purpose for Northern Ireland. So the work has started, and I know, and Jane's here today because she, like me, wants to see this work taken forward, driven forward, but so does the executive. The executive commitment is there. It's got to be not just a nice strategy which looks lovely and joined up on paper. It's got to be delivered, and that's the challenge. And the resourcing issue, I'll not pretend any more than any of the other speakers have pretended, resourcing will be a significant challenge, a really significant challenge. But if we get the momentum and the engagement around developing the strategy and get that going, then I think we can, we'll build a momentum that makes the case so compelling that the funding has got to come around it as well. We'll have to start somewhere, and I think the fact that it's there as a commitment in the recovery strategy, it will be there in the programme for government as well. We have a real opportunity now to get some momentum, and I know Jane's going to pick this baton up. There's a lot of enthusiasm across the departments, and I just think it's a really great opportunity, Jane, for you to carry on work that has just begun and get some real speed and momentum into it. So I know it's going to be in really safe hands, and being here today has just been so important for us to hear, to hear some of the stories. And we'll be working with Grania, we'll be working with Women's Aid, we'll be working with the commissioners on the IRC where the overlap is strong on tackling paramilitarism, and we'll be working with PSNI and Justice colleagues. This has got to be an integrated, joined up approach. We're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of good work, but it's not joined up necessarily, nor focused or strategic. So there's a lot of harnessing can be done. There are gaps, and we need to look at those, and we need to keep continuing the conversation. So I was really pleased, Sarah, to hear that this is just the first of a number of conversations, because they're hugely energising and hugely challenging, but I think that just makes us even more determined to work with you. So just really wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm departing in a short period of time, but there's hopefully going to be on this issue a seamless handover. So thank you.
Maybe just I come in as well, Jenny. And I guess this is my first public outing. I'm not yet in post, so I'm actually part of the economically inactive currently until I take off on the 1st of September. But actually what joy it brought me that this was my first public outing, because actually this is exactly the reason I applied for the job and I came through. And my background's private sector, in technology and in business. Generally the under 5-10% female kind of places, venture capital and engineering and technology. But actually, I'm a colleague of Granya's as a commissioner, but I also was a volunteer counsellor in Childline for 6 years. And actually, the pieces that we just talked about here and bringing those things together, and the need for that whole government approach, that you don't just solve it with one intervention or one policy intervention, it's a whole system piece, tackling paramilitarism, tackling economy, tackling opportunities, tackling skills. So, I mean, that we're both here together, I guess, shows that commitment, but you also have my commitment in the weeks and the days and the months ahead that it will be a key priority to drive forward those objectives, both personally and as part of the mandate from the role of Hawks as well. So really delighted to be here and looking forward to working with you in the times ahead.
Excellent, thank you so much. I'm so glad this is recorded. I'm the money woman. I have it all on recording, just to note. Excellent response. Any other questions? Mary?
Well, just before the response, I was going to ask Louise if there was anything she could do to influence the dilution of the legislation we have here. You know, we can't celebrate the legislation we have because it's so diluted. There's no resources, and you know, we always are hopeful that things are changing, but if we don't create the right legislation, things are not going to change. So I'm delighted to hear that the civil service are talking about resources to legislation, because things like housing, legal aid, those things will not, if we don't have those, we may as well not have the legislation, because it's not going to make an awful pile of difference, and that has to be said. Rachel, you're fabulous. Keep on being, you'll be known as one of the difficult women. There's loads of us out here, but I just think that we still need to keep on going. And I'm really glad that we're talking about paramilitarism, because I come from Derry, live in Derry, and the families and the children that are caught in behind that, you know, we're working with them on a daily basis, and the fear, so we don't have peace in Northern Ireland. And I got criticised for saying that, but we don't. Because while women and children aren't safe, there is no peace in Northern Ireland. And we have to start talking about it, because there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of dishonesty around it. And we do have in Derry, we have kids walked up lanes every day, every week. There's at least one walked up lanes to be shot. And an acceptance that, oh, well, they've done drugs, so that's okay. So we need to be starting to talk about this if we're ever going to change the climate in Northern Ireland. So I'm really enthused, and I hope that we can all work together and come back and perform a strong lobbying of not just Women's Aid, but Women's Aid and all the women that can make a difference in Northern Ireland, and those in the UK that can come slip in and make a difference if it's needed here as well, because sometimes that's the only opportunity we have to get things through. It shouldn't be that like that, but until we convince other politicians that they need to start doing what they need to do, you know, I think that's an option for us as well.
Okay, Louise, have you any?
Well, I mean, absolutely, Marianne, it's great to see you in real life as well. We've had many Zoom conversations. I remember very early on having a Zoom chat with Mary and said, I just want to get a picture of the situation facing women and girls in Northern Ireland. And Mary drew breath and didn't stop speaking for about an hour and a half. But I got a very good picture by the end of it. I mean, you're absolutely right, and Rachel's absolutely right in her assessment that, you know, you can have the best legislation in the world, but if it's not got the resourcing and the political will to drive culture behind it, then it's just going to sit on the shelf and never have any impact. And to be honest, I've seen some of that in the coercive control legislation over in England and Wales, because although it's there on the shelf and on the legislative books, if the CPS don't properly understand it, if lawyers don't understand it across the pitch, and if the judiciary doesn't understand it, then it's not going to be enforced. It's not going to change that culture across the criminal justice system as a whole, and it's not going to affect society. So it needs to come backed up with training right across the system and across kind of society as a whole. And it was great. Bobby and I spoke earlier in the week about the work that they've been doing with you to train over 4,000 members of staff across the PSNI jointly with Women's Aid on coercive control. That's going to have a really serious impact, and it shows the enormous success that can happen when we are truly joined up and all working in the same direction. I just want to say briefly in response to Jenny's point, we've not really talked much about online abuse, but it's something Alison and I have spoken out. I'm sure Rachel's been subject to it herself as politicians and as journalists, as women. We're subject to online abuse on a daily basis, and that is, of course, a gateway to much more extreme online harassment and physical abuse. And I think Bobby would be the first to say that we're not anywhere near good enough at tackling that end of the scale of online abuse, in the same way that actually we're not anywhere near good enough at tackling the more extreme end of child abuse. And the Labour Party has been campaigning for criminal sanctions for directors of tech companies and platforms that fail to tackle this issue on the platforms. We're now in a situation where no tech company or platform can legitimately or reasonably say that they are just a platform. They are responsible for the content that is that is used, exploited, and exacerbated and promoted on their platforms, and they should be criminally responsible and accountable for that. And we're going to be pushing for that through the Online Harms Bill. So we need to look at that as a fundamental part of any violence against women and girls strategy as well.
I just say in personal I work for a newspaper. If I libel someone, we're liable for it, but you can do whatever you want on Twitter and Facebook, which are making millions. And what struck me, if you try and talk about the patriarchy, is that the awful, disgusting racial abuse that the England players took after the Euros, that Twitter came out and stopped that straight away, whereas Diane Abbott has been getting threatened. I think when Amnesty did a survey, she had something like 300,000 abusive messages in 1 year, numerous of them, the majority of those racist, a lot of them threatening rape, and the tech companies didn't do anything then. So I want to know what's the difference between a woman of colour and a man who plays football of colour. Clearly they weren't too long coming out and saying that they had gathered all the data in relation to that, they had blocked all those people off the platform, and that they'd handed it over to law enforcement. But yet when it's women who are being abused, they're very slow to act.
It was the same with when COVID hit and the pandemic, overnight they could block misinformation and disinformation about COVID and the vaccine. They could take action almost immediately, but how slow they've been around every other kind of abuse and misinformation on their platforms.
Geraldine O'Hare.
Thanks very much, and Sarah, thank you, and congratulations to everybody. Women's Aid always do these fabulous events, and fair play to you. And I think and to get the two heads of the outgoing and the incoming head of civil service is fabulous. I work for Justice. I work on the other side of Justice. I'm the Director of Rehabilitation for Probation, so we work with perpetrators. And Monica and I always talk, as Mary and I, about the need for the early intervention, because we get the perpetrators when they're in the system. They're actually in the justice system. What we absolutely need to really push for is that early intervention. So in other words, before people come into justice, how do we actually target perpetrators or alleged perpetrators at that very early stage? Because if we do that, we improve everybody's outcomes and we reduce the number of victims coming through the courts and coming through society. So, we can have all the strategies that we want, but we absolutely need to capitalise on early intervention. We don't want to see these people in the system. We don't want to see them in court. And if there is a way of getting upstream, that's where we're going to have winners for everybody across the board. So we absolutely need to talk about education, and I'm talking about education from teacher training, going back to how do we educate people to educate others and to act as those role models, because all too often, I'm sure we've all heard people, and I hear it from within Justice as well, that, we know whenever we can predict those types of young people that are going to come into the system. We should never say that. We need to educate people, around how we do and how we prevent and how we apply that prevention a way back, because I always say, and I'm not being cynical because I've worked in justice for a very long time, but when they come into justice, it's very difficult because the harm has been done, the victims have been harmed, and families and societies have been impacted. So early intervention all the way. And it wasn't always easy for Women's Aid and probation to work together, and people around this room will know that, because often, we would have been questioned or indeed criticised for working with perpetrators, not by Women's Aid, but by others, and often it was difficult to have that joined up. But we're just coming at it from a different way. We're all on the same page. You're working at it from a victim's perspective. But as I always say, we cannot not work with perpetrators, because if we don't work with perpetrators, we will always work with victims. So that's my plea always, early intervention
and continuing work with perpetrators to prevent further victims and further harm.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Thank you. Any other?
Sure, can I just say?
Sorry, Eileen.
Just to follow up on
Eileen Murphy, Woman's Aid in Armagh Down.
Yes.
You're the Woman's Aid?
Does anybody not know me? Just follow up on what Shirley was saying, just something that I know has been said, it's been touched on today about education. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things I see every single day is the impact on children and young people. We have 5-year-olds attempting to hang themselves because of what they've experienced. The family court system is a tragedy for women and children. It really is a tragedy. And while we are looking, strategies are great, and yes, there needs resources, but there needs to be a determined effort by everybody to get into that as early as possible intervention. Because when you have a 5-year-old trying to hang himself from the bunk beds in a refuge, we have a problem in society. And we see that nearly every single day. So yes, women and girls, absolutely, but we need to be in there early, really, really early, because we have a serious, we are creating the perpetrators and the victims by doing nothing. And we can't afford to do nothing any longer.
Thank you. And as I say, a long time ago, we did a conference, it was Katrina Ryan said, if Women's Aid didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. And I'm so proud that I work for Women's Aid, and the amount of work that I see going on across our 8 groups across Northern Ireland every day is amazing, because we are here. We say children hear it, see it and feel it, right? But we see them, we hear them, and then we act on it. So I am a great believer in that, we're looking at ACEs, we identify that domestic abuse has an adverse childhood experience on a child. Let's not call it an ASBO, let's not make it a label, let's look at it and say we recognise harm has been done. What we need to do is put early intervention in. Sorry, and Fran from...
No, sorry, I just want to come in on that, just to really endorse what Eileen's saying in relation to children. And I hear what you're saying, we do terrific work, and I agree totally with early intervention. Excuse me, but recently we have a full team funded by Big Lottery who are being made redundant. So we're back to the drawing board. We've got youngsters crying out for support, and we are having to turn those youngsters because we do not have the resources to respond, unfortunately, to them. And like Eileen says, when you've got wee children coming in to a service, and then you can't offer them the service because we don't have the funding. We have relied on Big Lottery. Very fortunate with Big Lottery. When we have got funded, we have children need money. It's 2 part-time workers across an area that's Antrim, Ballymena, Carricklarn and Newtownabbey. 2 18-hour workers. So we are looking now for jigsaw money or jigsaw funding to fund a team to provide a core service. And I agree totally, early intervention to educate and inform our young girls and our young boys about domestic abuse and about what is a healthy relationship, because they have got so much mixed messages and all that internet, all that stuff. I mean, we had a young girl disclosing having a relationship with a boy who strangled her during sex and said that he thought that was the norm. That's what you do, because that's what he had seen. So we have a long way to go, but we are hamstrung. I'm with you. We do terrific work for our children and young people, but it's not enough. We don't have enough funding. It's not enough. And we're failing the children.
Yeah, and we do need to look at that. We have a children's 10-year strategy, but again, it's about supporting the infrastructure of all of those services. But I think what we have heard today is that Women's Aid, we are the experts, but we're not doing this alone. And I think we've heard commitment today that we aren't alone and that we do need to look at resourcing, especially around training. And I know Louise mentioned to talk to Bobby about training. I think Women's Aid is responsible for training, I don't know how many thousand people to this date today. E-learning came along, and out of chaos came opportunity. I think we've written about 6 e-learning packages for police, DOJ, and we're working with PPS. That's coming forward. But what we have done as well, where there isn't money, you have to look at innovation, you have to look at other ways of working. Housing Executive is a perfect example. We couldn't provide refuge for every single woman in Northern Ireland that needs it. We worked with Housing Executive. Law was changed, Monica. We talked about that this morning. And we created float and support with the Housing Executive. Change the law, give the women protection, support women within their homes. You know, the number going through float and support now compared to refuge, working together, using the experts here and the lived experience from the women and children in our services, and then sitting around the table and working together on this. I'm conscious that we have a lunch, and I'm really sorry, Bobby, there's a lunch. See what happens when you get out of the house? And you get a Danish, a cup of coffee and a lunch. Very sorry. Bobby, have you any comment you want to make while you're still on? Sorry, Monica.
Well, it might also include Bobby on this, but I think your point is really important, and Alison has raised it, we all have, is this new generation growing up and the exposure to pornography. I sat through a case, and it's now public, of a young, well, she wasn't so young, a George Mitchell scholar who came to Northern Ireland after the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and it was very public, and the papers reported her case, and she's a fantastic woman. She wrote a novel and it's now been made into a film, and she has a festival in London about her abuse, her rape in the park up in West Belfast. Conglin. So I sat in the court case to befriend her because Trina Varga got in touch with me as the George Mitchell Scholar organiser and asked if I'd accompany her, and I had asked permission because the young fella was under 18, and so I was allowed into the court. What had struck me about that court, and he did plead guilty in the end, and it was a bit of a mess because they'd come and booked places to stay and did all of that, and weren't informed that there wouldn't be a trial. But it was cathartic for her, and I went with her to see what was happening. And she wanted to see why such a young fella could have overcome her and assaulted her so seriously and left her with injuries as well as raped her. He was a big, tall 15-year-old. And it came out that he had been exposed to pornography. But what was more important, or was less important, was the fact that he was smoking cannabis. The judge made a big deal about the cannabis and hardly referred at all to the pornography. And that's where we need the training. And it's the same all those years that we worked on drink. Honestly, Your Honour, I was drunk. All right, well, he needs to be excused. Well, we don't if he's got the car keys in his hand. Sure we don't, Bobby, in terms of drinking and driving. And so we got to change that wasn't a diminished responsibility in terms of domestic violence. And we still have a long way to go on that in terms of intent, which you referred to. But pornography, that's the big issue, I think, of the current problems that we're facing. It is misogyny. And it's also the objectification of women's bodies. And that, in terms of whether it's Twitter or whatever else, that is influencing this misogyny. And it's leading, as you said, Mari's brilliant phrase, we don't have peace. As long as that's happening, there is a war against women in relation to how they're being used and children being used. And the Women's Aid's work will never end. But most importantly, and I'm glad that we have someone from the prosecution service and somebody from the police, and we should need somebody from our judiciary, the training that needs to go on in relation to decommissioning those mindsets and getting them into current modern thinking about the harm that's being caused into these young people's minds in terms of the attitudes. And that's where we need to make the connection. Sorry for taking so long, but it is such a huge and new issue. It's not new.
We needed an overnight conference.
Yeah.
Let's just be realistic. We certainly did. And Noelle Collins, Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. Noelle.
I'll just finish by saying thank you to all, everyone. It's been great to get out, certainly for me. Grania, can I say thank you to you, and I'm really looking forward to putting together a strategy. What I would say to you and to yourself, Jane, and anyone else, an invite to come to our refuges and talk to the women and the children that this is happening to, and that's where you'll get your feedback.
I really genuinely would. In fact, I spent, so that's a deal, and you can follow up with me immediately, and I spent yesterday out visiting traveller sites. Your phrase, boy do we have a lot to do, and 20 years ago I was writing about travellers, and to be on the same site, I literally was on the same site in Leghorn yesterday. 20 years off, 2 caravans, hard standing, same again. So look, I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, listen, thanks, and it was difficult at times just to pick up everything, but there were some absolutely fantastic points. Some of the things for me just that I would certainly very strongly agree and identify with was just the added threat that exists in our context. I think the point was made, this is still far from a normal and peaceful society, and that definitely creates a compound factor in terms of the risk and the threat posed to women and girls in a way that, whilst it may be, and maybe is a massive issue in England and Wales and on the rest of the island, it's just not added layer of complexity, it just makes all of our jobs a bit more challenging. And it's good to see the recognition of that, and I think the only way to address that is by moving together in order to tackle it. I also thought just at the start about the changing face and nature of crime, and I think that point has been well made as well in terms of underlining the need for appropriate training for police officers, just the kind of conventional role of what a police officer is, and historically kind of a thief taker almost described. We've seen big trend away from acquisitive crime, and the kind of day and daily work of police officers now is very much in this space. It's a far more sensitive role, one that requires real emotional intelligence and awareness of what victims have been through in particular. And having the support of Women's Aid and the delivery of that training has been absolutely fantastic for us. Louise mentioned, we talked earlier in the week, over 4,000 police officers and police staff have now engaged in the first of over 4 modules of training in order to make sure that we're prepared for the forthcoming legislation next year. But in addition to that, we recognise that kind of creating the initial capacity and skills within our workforce is just the beginning, because we've got an ongoing programme of continuous development to make sure that we are in a position to provide the best possible service to victims. And then just to pick up on Monica's point, I agree with that as well. And whilst technology has been phenomenal for us all when it works, in many ways it has been a massive enabler and an empowering factor. But equally, what it has done, I think, and to reflect again on Monica's comments, it has undoubtedly, I think, also served to be an uninhibiting factor in terms of exposing people to more extreme views, extreme contents. And I don't think there's any doubt that we do see a transference of that then into behaviours. And again, I think that's something that, in terms of training for police officers and awareness, it's something we need to focus on. So, I just want to say thanks very much for extending the invite to me. It's been really beneficial to me as well in terms of leading this as a strategic piece of work. And I did mention that we have a listening event on the 1st of September, and hopefully we can have as good a contribution on that day as we've had today to help shape how we take this forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bobby. And yes, this is the first of many. I think we all are in agreement, and I just want to finish up because lunch is there, and say thank you to everyone for coming, and a massive big thank you. What a panel we have. Shadow Secretary of State coming over to support us to work. Our women are so important, but look at the input everyone has given here today. I am just amazed by it. It's been the start of a conversation. We will have more, because I've been around Women's Aid a long time, and you see once they start to get something that they want to challenge or chase, they never let go. So we are here, and we will be ensuring these conversations continue. But a massive thank you to everyone today. This has been wonderful, and lunch is served in the yes, there was cold food and hot food, sorry, but lunch is served in the dining room, and how lovely was it to be face to face today. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone.